Check this out. The kingdom that Jesus came to this world to establish is so radically different from the kingdoms of this world that the church is blind to it. Hey, welcome back to Love Wins, where the truth matters because it's the truth that sets us free. So we're in the midst of this series on A Tale of Two Empires. We ended last time with Jesus going into the temple and turning everything upside down. And we explored how he did that intentionally. It was not a temper tantrum. He was demonstrating that everything that the church was teaching was opposite of who he was, what he was about, why he came, etc., etc. Now, the sobering part of that message is that the places where people would go to find out truth are the very places that were teaching anything but the truth. In my town, there are 166, according to the Yellow Pages, 166 places of worship. That's approximately one place for every 425 people. And so the question is, well, how many of those would you have to go to before you found some truth, or the truth, or Jesus? And the sad reality is, maybe you wouldn't find him anywhere. When I was living in another place, I endeavored to go to every church in that town. It was a smaller place. I think I ended up making it to 30 some of them. And honestly, when I was done, I was like, if I was on a search for Jesus and that was what I found, I think I might give up. You say, well, you're just saying all this because your end game is to get people to come to your church. Well, actually, it's messy. Like, my church represents a global denomination of millions of people, but every local congregation is very different. You may not notice the difference on the first day, but stay long enough and you'll notice the difference. That's why as I've tried to reach out through this channel to people who are either in church but not sure if they're going to stay, or have left and are not sure if they're going to come back, it's no small feat in today's world to find Jesus amongst a group of people called a church. This is not new. When Jesus came, his greatest opposition, his greatest enemies, the most pushback that he got was from people who claimed to be representing God and telling the truth. Yet they had no idea who he was or what he was about, and actually when they started to figure it out, they were against him, to the point that they ended up trying to kill him. I'm going to read for you how the Bible describes the state of religion, Christianity, in the last phase of human history. So the Bible teaches that at some point Jesus is going to come back, the world as we know it will end, and it will begin again like it was always supposed to be. So this is a description of what it's like just before that happens. I know your works, Jesus speaking, that you are not cold nor hot. I wish that you were one or the other. Because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I will vomit you out of my mouth. Because you say, I am rich and have become wealthy and have need of nothing, and do not know that you are wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked. So Jesus' description of the church is not a good one. But the most damning part of the description is not that they're in bad shape. That's not the problem. The real problem is that they're in this condition and don't know it. So today we're going to spend some time in the Gospel of John, John chapter 9. And I want to read for you an entire story so we get the full context. I try and keep these videos as short as I can, but to teach anything of substance does take a little bit of time. So John chapter 9, if you want to read along, starting in verse 1. Now as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth. So they must have known this guy, because the disciples and him were both aware that he'd been born blind. I mean, blind people don't have a sign on their forehead that says, I was born this way. So they had to have known the guy. And as his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now, before we go any further in the story, I want you to notice that their question was limited. It only offered two possible solutions. Somebody was to blame. He was born with this blindness condition. Was it his fault, or was it his parents' fault? You can see why they're asking the question, but you might not understand the deeper roots of where the question comes from. They're asking the question because neither answer is very comforting. To think that God would punish somebody with blindness for something that they did in the womb, well, that just seems crazy. But to punish him with blindness for something that his parents did, that also seems unfair. His parents weren't blind. We'll find that out later in the story. But the roots underneath the question is that the church taught people that if you were suffering in any which way, shape, or form, God did that to you for something that you did. That was divine payback. This is not true, but the church taught it as true. And I'm telling you that if the closer you get to finding out who Jesus is and what he's actually like, the more you're going to find out that the things that you learned in church aren't true. Many of them. Verse 3. Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned. That's not the issue. But that the works of God should be revealed in him. In other words, something's going to happen as a result of his blindness that he will rejoice about, that those who know him will rejoice about, and that will shed some light on who God is. Verse 4. I must work, just Jesus speaking still, I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day, while there's still time. The night is coming when no one can work, when it'll be too late. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. So if you want to know what the truth is, if you want to know where it's at, you got to follow me. That's what Jesus was saying. When he said these things, he spat on the ground, he spit on the ground, he made clay with the saliva, he anointed the man's eyes with the clay. And he said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. And he went and he washed, and he came back seeing. Therefore the neighbors, and those who previously had seen that he was blind, said, is not this he who sat and begged? So you can imagine, this is probably some small town around Galilee. Everybody knew this guy. So when he came back seeing, everybody's like, neighbors, friends, they're like, what? We know this guy. Isn't that the same? Isn't this the beggar? Verse 9. Some said, this is he. And others said, he looks like him. But he said, I am he. So some immediately accepted, yeah, that's him. Others were like, oh, no, it can't be. It looks like him, granted, but it can't be. But the guy who was blind and now he's seeing says, yeah, it's me. It's me. Verse 10. Therefore they said to him, how? How did this happen to you? How were your eyes open? How did you go from being blind to being not blind? How did you go from being able to see, not see, to being able to see? Like, what in the world? He answered and said to him, a man. He didn't know the man, couldn't see him at the time. He didn't get his eyesight till he was away from Jesus, on his way to the pool. A man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. A man named Jesus. He didn't know who he was. It reminds me of a story. Someone was on vacation I think it was in Scotland, and they came upon a guy, and they're asking, he was with a woman, an elderly woman, and asking, they were local, asking him if they'd been there, if they'd ever lived here, whatever. And the lady said, yeah, I have a place over the hill or whatever. And anyway, it was the queen. The guy was speaking to the queen. He had no idea. So anyway, he asked the man who was with the queen if he knew the queen. if he'd ever met her. He's like, oh yeah, I've met her. And the queen just played along. She didn't say who she was. And so then the guy wanted to take a picture with this man who knew the queen. So he could go home and show his pictures. Hey, man, I met a guy in Scotland. I talked to him. He knows the queen. And they got the queen to take the picture. And then the queen's like, why don't you take a picture with me in it? Never did tell him. So at some point, they went home and were showing the pictures, and somebody was like, knows the queen? That is the queen. A man named Jesus. Common name. Jesus is not some special name. We think it is, but it's not. Joshua, Jesus, Jose, it's all the same name. A man named Jesus anointed my eyes, and he said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. So I went, and I washed, and I received my sight. Then they said to him, where is he? And he said, I don't know. But do you see what happened? Because the man went from being blind to being able to see, everyone who met him and knew how he had been versus how he was were like, how did this happen? Oh, some guy named Jesus. Where is he? Where is he? Verse 13. They brought him who formerly was blind to the Pharisees. Now it was a Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes, and the Pharisees also asked him again how he received his sight, and he said to them, he put clay on my eyes, and I wash, and I see. Therefore some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. Because, he's asking a guy to go walk too far on the Sabbath, wash his eyes on the Sabbath, he's making clay on the Sabbath. He's breaking so many rules in the Jewish rule book, it's unfit. He's a Sabbath breaker. He can't be from God. Others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was division among them. Even within the church that was so far off the rails, there were some who were like, this guy has to be from God, because who else could do this? And the rest were like, oh, no. He broke all of our rules. There's no way God's going to send someone who's going to do all that and break our rules. So even within the church that's so far outside of where they're supposed to be, there's division over who Jesus is. So they said to the blind man again, what did you say about him because he opened your eyes? What do you say? Verse 17. They said to the blind man again, what do you say about him because he opened your eyes? He said, I think he's a prophet. You're like, who do you think he is? Well, I think he's a prophet. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight until they called the parents of him who had received his sight. So now this has turned into a full-on investigation. We got to get to the bottom of this. What's going on? We don't even believe you were blind. You're just lying. So they got his parents. They asked them, saying, is this your son, whom you say was born blind? How then does he now see? Well, you claim he was blind, so now you explain to us how he can see. His parents answered and said, we know that this is our son, and we know that he was born blind. But by what means he now sees, we do not know. Who opened his eyes? We do not know. He is of age. Ask him. We're going to see more of it in a second, but there had developed so much tension between Jesus and the organizations that claimed to represent God, so much division between them, so much angst between them, so much conflict between them, that these parents don't even want to get involved with something that involves a miracle with their own son. Yes, we know he's our son. Yes, we know he was born blind. That's as much as we know. That's as much as we're going to say. He's of age. You ask him. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews. We're scared of them, and yet we still don't want to upset them because we want to be part of them. How messed up is that? For the Jews had agreed already, verse 22, that if anyone confessed that Jesus was the Messiah, the Christ, that's what it means, Christ Messiah, same thing, he would be put out of the synagogue. So put out of the synagogue means It doesn't just mean, like in our culture, like people go to church, they don't go to church, whatever. It really has nothing to do with where I live, with the fabric of society. But for a Jew, if you're out of the synagogue, you're out. You're out of the community. That's bad news. Like that is not the way you want to live your life. Therefore, his parents said, he's of age, ask him. We do not want to get involved. We don't want to get on the wrong side of you. We want to live our quiet life, go to the synagogue, be involved in the community, have people come to our business, we'll go to their businesses. We do not want to be them. 24. So again they called the man who was blind and said to him, give God the glory. Swear on the Bible. Let's start telling the truth here. We the church, we know that Jesus guy is a sinner. I mean, look what he did on the Sabbath. Look what he got you to do on the Sabbath. He answered and said to them, whether, this is the blind man speaking, who isn't blind anymore, whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I know, I was blind, and now I see. Then they said to him again, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And he answered them, I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become one of his disciples? Whew. I could make a whole video on that. Here you have a man who's met Jesus, who was blind, but now he can see. And he's saying to the leadership of the church, sarcastically, do you want to be one of his disciples too? In other words, I know you don't. It's ludicrous to suggest that you, the leaders of God's church, would actually want to follow him. "28. Then they reviled him, and they said, you are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we do not know where he comes from." That's true. The man answered and said to them, why, this is a marvelous thing, that you do not know where he is from, yet he opened my eyes. In other words, he did something for me that you couldn't dream of doing. Isn't that weird? Verse 31. Now we know that God does not hear sinners. But if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered and said to him, you were completely born in sins, and you are teaching us? And they threw him out. The man makes an interesting point. In the Old Testament, there are miracles, many of them. There are even dead people brought back to life in the Old Testament. But there is no record previous to Jesus that the blind were made to see. We're going to finish the last little bit of this story, and I'm going to come back and explain to you why I believe that is. Verse 35. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, the man who was blind. And when he found him, he said to him, do you believe in the Son of God? The blind man answered, used to be blind man, answered and said, who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him? And Jesus said to him, you have both seen him, and it is he who is speaking with you now. And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshipped him. Then Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may be made blind." Then some of the Pharisees who were with him heard these things. Pharisees, that's the real religious of the religious. They heard him and they said, "Are we blind also?" Are you saying we're blind, Jesus? Last verse of the story. Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no sin. But you say we see, and therefore your sin remains." You see, there's something worse than being blind. It's being blind and not knowing it. And I believe it's completely intentional. It's by God's design that he demonstrated himself through miracles in the Old Testament. There's a little flashes of light all through that dark Old Testament. But not one of those miracles is changing the blind to being able to see, because that's something only Jesus can do. What I see here is that it's easier for God to raise the dead than it is to get the blind to see. And I don't mean the blind whose eyes don't work. I mean the blind who think they have all the answers, who think they're right, who judge Jesus by their rules rather than reevaluating their rules by Jesus. Churches through history have this record of constantly codifying and defining and building walls around how they think it is. Walls so thick and so high that Jesus himself can't find a way in. One of the biggest leaders in my church in the late 1800s said, "I don't think God is among us." That's a big statement. She also referred at another time to Laodicea as referring to all of Christianity. Laodicea was that description I read at the beginning of Jesus saying, "I know your works. You think you're all this and all that, but you're poor, miserable, blind, and naked, and you don't even know it." She said that condition describes all of Christianity, but particularly refers to the church to which she belonged. And she described it as a lifeless, Christless church. So I don't know if you went to a Baptist church. I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. I'm neither ashamed of that nor proud of that. I don't ascribe any value to my denominationalism. I'm a sinning, forgiven, blood-bought son of God. Not because of anything I've done, but because of who he is. And I can't wait to make the next video for you about being blood-bought. Religion has a high record, a high incidence rate of claiming they know everything, yet not knowing the only one that it matters to know. Jesus, are you saying we're blind? If you were blind, it wouldn't be a problem. That's what Jesus said. Your problem is you think you see. Your own thoughts, perhaps your family, perhaps culture, and especially the church will reinforce this idea that the problem is your sin, that you're not good enough. Jesus can deal with all of that. What Jesus can't deal with is violating our freedom. He cannot take a person who insists that they're right There's nothing to be done. You can see the conflict in this chapter. You can see the angst even within the leaders of the church. You can see they're kicking people out who dare to believe in Jesus. The conflict is increasing and increasing. It's a conflict between the organization that claims to be his and him. Do you see the crazy irony of that? I'm telling you, it's 2023. If you really want to find Jesus, I'm here to help, but I'm a flawed, broken human being. And if I send you to church, you may find Jesus, but you probably won't. The search is up to you. He's looking for you, or you wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be talking together. In response to him searching for you, he says, search for me and you will find me if you search with all of your heart. Which means we cannot afford to have any idea that we build a wall around and say, I'm judging God by this conclusion that I've made. That's the mistake churches make over and over again. It's the mistake that we as individuals make over and over again. It's time that we let the healer heal our blindness. We'll see you next time.